Hello everyone and welcome. We're just getting the meeting ready to start, so bear with us for a moment. Welcome everybody. We're going to get started now. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first webinar on the Black Adoption Project. We're really pleased to have you all with us, and I'm just going to introduce ourselves to you, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the webinar is going to go and what we're going to cover today. So firstly, my name's Lydia. I am Head of Service for Adopt London North, which is a regional adoption agency in London, and I'm one of the leads for this project with Laurelle Brown, and I'm going to ask Laurelle to introduce herself.
So good afternoon, everyone. Apologies, I am not very well today, but obviously couldn't miss this event. So I am Director of Laurelle Brown Training and Consultancy, and our specialism is we work with organisations in the children's sector to tackle inequalities across systems for children.
Thank you, Laurelle. And we're very pleased to welcome a couple of panelists with us today. I wonder if, John, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thanks, Lydia. So, hi, my name is John Wainwright. I work at the University of Central Lancashire. I am the director of a research centre called GRACE, Global Research Centre for Equality, in UCLan, up there in Preston, Lancashire. Thanks, Lydia.
Fabulous. Thank you, John. And Tam, we're very pleased to welcome you. Can you introduce yourselves?
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I'm Tam Kane. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex, just here in nice and sunny Brighton. So it's good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for coming, Tam. That's brilliant. So we're going to, we've got a brief time together today of 1 hour. We're going to talk through the findings of our first stage report, and then we're going to have some time for questions and discussion. As we're going through today, please feel free to use the chat as we go along to pose your questions or reflections and thoughts. The chat's being monitored, and we have a short time at the end where we'll pick a few questions to ask people, to ask the panelists and ourselves who lead the project. But any other questions that we don't get round to covering today, we will make sure we follow up in future webinars. Just to say as well that today is just our first webinar. We're not going to be able to cover everything that we're doing within the project, but we are hoping to have webinars regularly going forwards where we can focus on different areas of the project. So we will touch on things that we might not be able to go into in detail today due to time limitations. Okay, Laurelle, do you want to share the presentation? Next slide. So just to give you a little bit of context about the project, as many of you may be aware, disparities for Black children in the adoption system has been a stuck problem in the UK for decades. We see those disparities across a range of areas, but this is something that's been common knowledge and accepted across the adoption sector. And this project is an attempt starting from coming together into regional adoption agencies and having wider reach and wider number of local authorities and children that we're responsible for. It's an attempt for us to try to understand those disparities and address them in a way that we've not been able to do previously. Recent studies and insights suggest that despite lots of anti-racism comms in recent years, understanding of these issues and the impact of them is still limited. And so our project covers both practice, workforce, and also wanting to communicate findings and insights more broadly. Next slide. We are trying to take an approach that is maybe unusual within the local authority sector. So as regional adoption agencies in London, we are 4 REAs working together, covering 24 London local authorities. That in itself is unusual for us to be covering such a broad range of different local authorities, all trying to work together to tackle this issue. But also uniquely in this project, taking a partnership approach with Laurelle Brown and her team in having an independent consultancy involved to help us look at this from a different perspective and address it in a way we've not been able to do in the past. We were also, right from the beginning of the project, built everything around strong partnership with external stakeholders, and particularly people who are in our communities in London and those with lived experience of adoption, and more recently bringing on board and weaving in academics and other groups who have knowledge that we really need to tap into as well. Why only Black children is a really important question to address. It's one that we get asked frequently. The reason why we've taken this approach is because we found historically within adoption that children and adults from global majority ethnic backgrounds have often been grouped together when we're looking at data and disparities. And in adoption particularly, we actually don't see the same disparities across some other global majority backgrounds. For example, with Asian children, we find that there are fewer Asian children in the adoption system, but more prospective adopters. And with Black children, we see that things are the other way around. And so we found that what we were, by grouping all of these ethnic groups together, we were actually watering down the sense of understanding the disparities that were impacting Black and mixed Black ethnicity children. We did do some work as well, thinking with our stakeholders and people with lived experience about how we were going to define Black within the project, and recognizing that the use of that term in itself can be problematic and can give the sense that we're trying to put lots of people from lots of different backgrounds into the same category. But we felt that as an umbrella term to try to convey the group of children that we want to support and end disparities for, this was helpful to name within the project.
Building on Lydia's point there about the definition of Black, I was just going to add that what we also wanted to recognise is that racialisation is one of the factors that underpins the disparities that we see when it pertains to the outcomes of racialised children and families in the adoption process. So whilst we recognise that Black is a contested term and it's also a construct, racialisation is very much at the heart of why some of these children and families are experiencing these really disparate outcomes. So next slide, please. So in terms of the project, just to talk you through a little bit about the structure and what is different, if you can go to the next slide, please, Lydia. So this is the theory of change for the project, and we will put this up somewhere publicly accessible soon, because it will be very difficult for you to see the detail here. But what we essentially did to develop this theory of change, and we recognise that this is the theory of change now, it will be an iterative process and it will evolve as the project continues. But what we did to develop the first one for this project is three workshops, in-person workshops with different groups. So we had a workshop with a group of people from Black communities, so grassroots organisations, community members with no experience or knowledge of adoption. We did another workshop with some of our stakeholders in the project, Black stakeholders, and we also did a workshop with Black children that have experience of adoption. And as a project team, we also had some input, and all of the views, all of the inputs resulted in lots of post-it notes, and these were just condensed into this visual that you'll see here. And so this was developed by Tamara Jade Kaz. It was really important for us to also collaborate with a racialised illustrator to produce this piece of work. So just to mention her, but what you'll see there really illustrates what we are trying to achieve with this piece of work. I unfortunately don't have time to go into the detail with you right now, but I just want to draw on the project goals so everybody is familiar with those as we continue through the webinar. So we've got 5 goals for this project, and they really relate to 5 different stakeholders or outcomes. The first goal is for us to achieve a level playing field for Black families throughout the whole adoption process. The second goal is a reimagined system that meets the needs of Black children in need of adoption. The third goal is Black communities understand and care passionately about formal adoption and talk about it as a normal part of life. Fourth goal, Black adopted children have access to the support they need throughout childhood. And fifth goal, Black children and families are supported by a confident, anti-racist and culturally competent workforce. Next slide, Lydia. And the work that we're doing, you can see they're very ambitious goals, and this is a long-term project, sky's the limit kind of project, but we need that if we're going to really make a difference in these long-standing issues. So the work streams are therefore divided into 4 strands. One is lived experience, one relates to the workforce, another in research, another practice, as you can see on screen. So lived experience is us really having the involvement and partnership with people with lived experience of adoption, but also community members who might want to be, who might want to consider adoption at some point, but for whatever reason haven't been able to. Workforce, so this is the workforce as a whole, but also the workforce that is racialised as Black, doing some specific activities to support them in their roles. Research, which we'll talk to you today about in detail, and practice. So a lot of the research is action research, which is activities that we will be testing out and piloting in practice with children and families. Next slide, Lydia.
So the focus of today's webinar is to talk you through the research that we conducted, and hopefully as of when signing up for this webinar today, you've had access to the report, which has a lot more detail than we're going to be able to go into now. But we wanted to give you an oversight of the key findings of our research. So what we wanted to know, these were our research questions. What factors encourage and discourage and enable and prevent Black families from adopting? And what are the levels of awareness of and perception about Black children in need of adoption, alongside understanding what disparities are occurring, to what extent, and where in the process those took place. And you can see there a list of qualitative and quantitative methods that we used as part of our research, and combining those methods was really important actually in trying to understand things in more depth, and that's an approach we'll be using going forward. So in terms of our research looking at adoption and population data, we analysed the data that we already hold across our 24 local authorities that make up Adopt London, but we analysed those from a disparities lens. And we were able to do that by also holding for other factors. So for example, other factors that might impact on the adoption of children, for example, being older or having a sibling, we were able to make sure that it wasn't those factors alone that were impacting on the disparities that we saw. One of the most significant findings in the report is illustrated on this page, where we used adoption data, children in care data, and population level data to show that for every one white looked after child in London, there were 1,417 white adults in the London population. But when we look at our Black children, for every one Black child looked after, there were 396 Black adults in the London population. So that tells us 2 really important things. Firstly, the overrepresentation of Black children within the care system. But secondly, in terms of an adoption recruitment perspective and the challenges that we're facing, how much harder this is going to be able to recruit the number of prospective adopters we might need to care for children who need those placements. We know that overrepresentation is an issue that is national and has been addressed, really thoroughly examined in particularly research published by the Nuffield Foundation, which we relied on in our report. And we share a little bit more there about some of the details, looking at the proportion of children that we're placing for adoption from different ethnicities. So we looked at delay for children, and we found that Black Caribbean children were 12 times more likely than other children to have a code used by the local authority in their data returns, which is called prospective adopters could not be found. And this was entered as a code at the point where adoption was changed as the care plan and was no longer going to be the care plan for these children. So we know that finding the right adopters for children is a key factor in them not going on to be adopted when they had that plan. We also see that Black African and Black Caribbean children were 3 to 3.5 times more likely to have their plan changed after a placement order, rather than the placement order not being granted by the court, and 20% less likely to have been successfully placed for adoption within the period that we analysed. So these are all figures that we came into this research aware that there were disparities, but having these findings clearly showing us the levels and the places in the process where these disparities are occurring is really helpful in moving forward. In terms of timescales, when other factors are held constant, Black children spent on average 6.5 to 8 months longer in the adoption process. And we know that that has significant impacts in terms of both their ability to settle and form attachments in their adoptive family, but also the likelihood that they might experience instability in foster care during that waiting process. And the most significant delays did occur in the family finding stage, and that was where the delays were occurring for the children. We also looked at this data for adopters and prospective adopters, and we found that although timescales were similar across ethnic groups, our Black-only ethnicity households, so that means households where either a single parent is Black or one or both parents are Black in a couple, were around 5 to 6 times more likely than white-only households to leave the adoption process without adopting a child. I'm just going to highlight a few key findings from this section and talk about the fact that we particularly noticed that the timescales were similar for prospective adopters, but we expected to see that the matching part of the process, which is after approval, the process of adopters being linked with a child and then going on to be that match to be approved at the panel, we expected that to be quicker for Black adopters because of the shortage that we have. And actually, we saw that that took the same time across ethnic groups. So there are lots and lots of questions that this data raises for us, which we don't fully understand yet. We have hypotheses, but we're going to go on to look at these in more depth as we continue with the project. Structural barriers is a really important area as well to acknowledge, and we know that this is a nationwide issue, but is particularly often even more strongly felt in London, where we see the impact of things like small housing, overcrowded, and maybe more financially unstable arrangements. And we know from data that's publicly available that households of Black ethnicity were more likely to have a lower average weekly income, were more likely to live in the most income deprived areas and the most employment deprived areas. So in terms of the criteria that we're applying for prospective adopters, where we expect them to have space within their home, we're expecting them to have stable accommodation and stable employment where they're able to afford to take time off work, we know that when we're applying those barriers, that criteria, we're actually disadvantaging Black prospective adopters more than we are adopters of other ethnic backgrounds. So just to go on to talk briefly about our insights from the qualitative side of our research and some of the key findings here. So in terms of things that hindered and discouraged adoption, financial barriers was something that came up repeatedly, which relates to the last slide. The adoption process itself, post-adoption support, and racism. And I'm going to talk briefly about each one of those. People who responded to our surveys and focus groups spoke about needing more help financially, not just to overcome the barriers to get into the adoption process, but actually to feel reassured that they could go on to afford to care for this adopted child and give them the best possible opportunities as they grew up in their adoptive family. The adoption process, it's well known that it can be lengthy and can be a challenging process, and there were lots of perceptions about this, some accurate, some inaccurate, within people who responded to the research, and it was felt that that in itself was a barrier. People also particularly spoke about the need for different kinds of supports through the process and the importance of representation within the adopter journey. And post-adoption support, there was lots of responses and feedback about the need for support to be more readily available, but also to be specifically able to address some of the needs that Black families might feel that they have that were specific to them, and that covered things as well like the availability of Black therapists and therapy and support that was culturally appropriate and culturally informed. And racism came out in many different ways within our research as being a key factor, both actually within perceptions and questions that might exist within people's family and friends networks or communities about adoption, public perceptions that people are aware of, but also people's experiences directly within the adoption system or wider support systems themselves. And you'll see there a graph showing one of the questions that we asked was about how adoption was perceived, and interestingly about the way in which Black boys were perceived within the public views of adoption as well. So it's really important to recognise that the impact of racism pervades everything that we're trying to do, and needs to be confronted in trying to overcome these disparities.
And Lydia, just to add there as well, that final slide also highlighted the need for us to apply an intersectional lens in this project and all that we're doing. The perception of Black boys versus Black girls, you'll see there, is quite different. But also when we had feedback responses from focus group participants, the issues and experiences for single Black women, for example, appeared to be worse and compounded compared to couples, for example. So just something for us to also consider.
Yeah. So where are we now? Having completed this research, we have been focusing a lot on the development of the theory of change, which we showed you at the beginning, and using the findings from the research and the theory of change and our work with stakeholders to develop a series of pilots, which are pilots that are spread across the range of the adoption system. So some of them are about addressing how prospective adopters come into the process and their experience of the process at the beginning, whereas others are addressing support later on, the availability of therapists, and workforce issues as well. So our key focus now is building partnerships, sharing our learning, continuing to undertake more research into the areas in which actually the data raised more questions than answers for us, and we know that we need to go in and look in more depth at key areas to answer those questions, and doing all of this really in partnership with our stakeholders, our steering committee and our stakeholder groups, so that everything is informed by them. Thank you. I'm going to end the presentation now. And that was a very brief overview of what we've been up to, but we're hoping now to just invite a few reflections and insights from Tam and John, if you wouldn't mind coming on camera. So our first question to you, and if you could just answer briefly your thoughts on the report findings, and what your reflections are on the task of addressing the presence and impact of racism in adoption particularly. I don't know who wants to go first.
John, I'm happy for you to go first.
Thanks, John.
Okay, thanks for the really interesting and inspiring presentation, Laurelle and Lydia. My reflection is that the Black Adoption Project developing your theory of change has named something that has been a challenge for Black children and Black adoption for a long time now. And the impressive thing about BAP is that you've actually developed a theory of change and clearly made the link between the many structural racisms, the lived experience of Black people in the Black community and Black families, how this impacts on Black children and Black families, and how it then affects negatively the opportunities for Black families to come forward to adopt. And so it's an interlink between these different systems, the complexity of these systems that I think is really helpful now, because this has been going on for literally decades, really. So my reflection is that by A, naming structural racism, and then B, having a clear, practicable strategy to address it within the adoption system, there are possibilities for great progress to be made. And just before I finish there, Lydia, just you mentioned Black children and how Black boys are pathologized. We know that the longer the Black children stay in the care system, we know that the Black boys in particular are criminalized as a consequence of this. So the urgency of the work the Black Adoption Project is developing is imperative, is paramount importance. Those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you, John. And Tam?
Yeah, thank you so much. And just really to say thank you so much for the fantastic work that you're doing. And like on my reflections are, we go back to the works of Selwyn back in the 90s as well, talking about the challenges for Black communities through adoption processes. And just looking at the chat, somebody said something needs to change. And I think we've been working towards change, and your work is suggesting that actually we're not making progress. So just reflecting on your work and really thinking around terms that we probably don't appreciate very much, unconscious bias and things like that. And I think my starting point would be, maybe we need to be doing a little bit more work around that, and really some true soul searching in terms of adoption assessments and our engagement and having those conversations, because I think there's a hesitance to explore race and racism and to explore race and identity generally during assessments, and just thinking about the barriers that you spoke about in your work. And I think for me, it goes back there in terms of where am I, in terms of the own difference that I'm bringing in the space of the assessment, and what am I seeing in terms of the prospective adopters from the Black community who are coming in this space. And I'm really pleased to see that we are not using the term global majority, because sometimes we get stuck in the terminology that is brought our way in our practice. And often then we're generalizing people's experiences and we're missing the task. And I think we need to see identity. We need to see whatever it is that people are bringing within that space and understanding their own experiences as well. Because if we're not able to change the narrative, what we have is that already within the community, the word goes around that adoption processes are hard. So if we're not changing how we're inviting people to the room, inviting people to our spaces to show that we are welcoming you, that adoption process is going to be very difficult, because already I've got that impression that it's going to be hard. So I think something needs to change. What needs to change right at the front to say we're welcoming, and actually we're going to be very inclusive in the work that we're doing, and then really thinking about our own biases that we bring into that space, and that we work on that, and being really open to understanding people's experiences, and really appreciating that Black communities have those challenges that you identified there, and that we need to work with that. But that doesn't mean we need to ignore the importance of being robust and what we're looking for in terms of adopters who are going to provide permanency. But it means that we need to be understanding those lived experiences and thinking about how we shift in how we are bringing in systemic barriers. So thank you so much for bringing that forth.
Thank you, Tam. And I just wanted to reflect on, I suppose, what you're saying is particularly important around that we need to make sure that the message is that we're absolutely welcoming and communicating the right message to Black prospective adopters, but also ensure that when they do come through our door and we're assessing them, that we can live up to that in terms of the service that we're delivering, the way we undertake that assessment, that we're living out our values and the message that we're trying to put out. And what I hear from both of you as well, I think about you know, the value of naming and talking about racism and the impact that we see, both systemic racism within our systems. Just talking about that and naming it is a really, really important starting point for all of us, isn't it, in trying to overcome these challenges. I just wanted to go on to ask you both whether, so we're attempting to implement a different approach to try to address this issue and bring about change, but we'd really love to know what we can learn from other work that you've been involved with or other work that you're aware of that talks to these issues. Do you want to start, Tam, and then we'll go to John?
Okay, sure. I'm happy to do that. I think it goes back to my own reflections, actually, listening to your presentation and reading your report. And the question is, what's happening to those children who are then not adopted? You said that they stay longer in the adoption system, or in foster care, and others go for transracial adoption, where there's a match. It's interesting to look at the statistics, and my work is around transracial adoption. And when we then want to look at the experiences of adults who have been in the adoption system or adults who've been transracially adopted, what we are seeing is that experiences of racial trauma, not just racial trauma within the family, but also racial trauma outside of the family. And we've got adoptive parents who are not able to deal with those issues around race. So I think for me is where those children land and then their identity outcome long term. So when we then want to think about the relationship between the work that you're doing, the lack of prospective adopters or adopters from the Black community, and where these children are going, my work is really thinking about how then do we prepare adopters who are going to adopt children transracially. I think that's really important, because the reality is we haven't got enough adopters from the Black community. So what needs to happen now? We need to be doing a lot of work to prepare social workers to think about preparing prospective adopters around supporting the identity outcomes of children who are moving in transracial adoption. However, that doesn't mean we need to stop campaigning, though. We need to stop doing the work that we are doing to be more inclusive and increasing the numbers of adopters. I just have a couple of points that I really want to make. And I think these are important points from the work that we're doing around trauma, taking a trauma perspective approach. So I guess the challenge that I might give to social workers in the space of recruiting is that when we're doing this work as well, we need to be thinking about trauma perspective in the lens of a child who's going to be going into transracial adoption and what that means for them, if in terms of what's going to be lost. I tend to use the word lost for the child in terms of cultural identity and their own identity. Not always welcome a term, but most certainly when children are moving in transracial adoption, something is going to be lost in respect of their culture and their identity. So we need to be thinking about that. Then we need to be thinking about being intentional in understanding identity for children, in understanding the difference and supporting that cultivation of difference across the child, as well as the adopters, the importance of their parents. You spoke about matching, and a reflection coming from our work is that actually matching documents are not always thorough. We don't always have enough information about children, and therefore during the matching process, that term that you used, couldn't find a match. I think if I've got that right, let's think about where that might be coming from. So I think for me, in terms of the work that I'm doing and what you're talking about here, it's also that we need to be much more detailed in our recording of identity. Because if we haven't got that, then you're going to see a cultural mismatch or a mismatch in the outcome that a child can be adopted, because we haven't got that. And if we also then want to go back to the idea that actually when we're looking at Black and matching, we're not looking at color, the task is so hard, because it's likely that if you're looking for a child of a particular culture, let's give an example, Nigerian particular tribe, are you really going to find an adopter who's Nigerian of that specific tribe? We have a challenge. You will attempt, you will try, but what do we have to work with? So that information is really, really important in terms of supporting the matching processes and hopefully addressing some of the numbers where we are seeing, and hopefully that quotation will change. Can't find a match. That's really powerful. So I think, yeah.
Thank you, Tam. Thank you for those really helpful reflections. And Laurelle, did you want to make a comment about that?
No, I mean, I just think you really highlight everything about why this project's so important, Tam, reflecting obviously on your transracial adoption research and work. The points that you make really resonate, and I think just motivate Lydia, myself and the team to really push forward so that we do have more options and availability when it comes to Black communities and prospective adoptive families for these Black children. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to invite John now to just share some comments and reflections on the work he's been involved in. I just, before we go to John, I just wanted to remind you to please do put your questions in the chat. Somebody's having a look at those now so that we can come to some of those at the end of the session. And we are going to be reminding you as well about signing up to our newsletter so that we can continue to communicate with you as a project as we go forwards. So John, could I invite you to just reflect on your work and what we can learn from that?
Thanks, Lydia, and thanks, Tam, for your observations, your reflections. Three clear points came from the research that we undertook with Black families back in 2010 to 2012. One was that if you, and which you are, BAP, if you invest in Black families and invest in resources, then the families are there to provide the adoption service. They are there. This is a resource, a systems issue. The second point, the key point that we gained from our research was that the need for a bespoke service, often, not invariably, often for Black families, for Black prospective adopters, and indeed by definition Black children, is really important. And time again, not only within Black adoption services, but in Black mental health, Black children in care, Black in the criminal justice, I've done research across the board. There is a need for bespoke, culturally and ethnically sensitive practice for Black families, provided by Black practitioners and Black managers. Not exclusively, but there's definitely a need for that as well. So invest in Black communities. You talk about community champions. Focus on bespoke services, and the third point, the key finding was that we Black people, the Black community, we are heterogeneous. So the idea that we're all one size fits all is simplistic nonsense, and we need to be aware of that. Whilst we want to have bespoke services, there are a variety of ethnicities, cultures, dual heritages that need to be met within this process. So it's almost like turning the lens back. So sure, there's structural many and different races and so on and so forth. But if we see Black as a lived and culturally exciting experience, something to be celebrated, and work on that basis, there are, as long as resources are invested, significant opportunities for Black families and Black children. And as I say, that my experience so far, the Black Adoption Project that is what you're doing. You're celebrating Blackness. That's it.
Thank you very much, John. And I think that really touches upon as well what we're trying to explore in our pilots going forward, that we look forward to telling you more about in a future webinar, to really understand actually where there's opportunities to sometimes make small changes, sometimes large changes, particularly around resources and attention focus, that we feel everything that we've learned so far suggests that there is really genuine impact opportunity to impact these disparities. Actually, the more we're learning, the more we're going through the project, we're not feeling like these are impossible issues to address. We're feeling like there are lots of opportunities to try to change this reality for our Black children in the adoption system. So it's so helpful to learn from the work that you've been doing and the work that Tam and many others have been doing as we go forwards. We're going to go now to take some of your questions. We're only going to be able to cover a few questions in the time that we have, but we really appreciate all your comments and questions, so keep them coming. We're going to be taking away all of those that we haven't addressed and making sure that we can focus on those in future webinars. While we're just getting the questions ready, I'll just say that we're hoping to hold regular webinars, and if you're signed up to our newsletter, we'll be letting you know about those. What we intend to do is to be able to focus on different areas of the project in much more detail than we have been able to today. Laurelle and I could talk about this project for probably 3 days straight if Laurelle had her voice, without running out of things to say. So a really important factor for us is both sharing what we're learning and finding with as many people as possible to impact change, but also learning from you and the insights that that you're able to bring, so that can impact on the work of the Black Adoption Project as well. So hopefully Tam and John are going to help us with some of the questions. Hannah, have we got any questions that we can take?
I've got the questions.
Hello, yes.
Oh,
okay.
Laurelle.
Yeah. So the first question, just because I've been matching them to what John and everyone has been saying. So if you give me a second, Hannah, the first one comes naturally off the back of what John was just saying. Somebody's asked, is there scope to make the assessment process and PAR more culturally sensitive to assessing prospective adopters from Black heritage? And obviously John's final point there was about cultural competence and cultural sensitivity, but I know that Lydia, we have some plans around this. So I thought this was timely as the first question.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful point, and absolutely something that we need to really examine, both the systems and the processes that we already have in place, as well as looking at how equipped our workforce are to be able to assess and respond to people appropriately and adapt the assessment style that they're undertaking according to the people in front of them that they're assessing. And particularly coming from the perspective that we're a local authority-based service, we both recognise the importance of having a diverse workforce that can reflect the ethnicities of prospective adopters, but also absolutely needing all of our social workers and staff to feel really confident and equipped to assess anybody appropriately and respectfully. And I think there's a really important challenge, and something that we are intending to look in much more depth is to audit the processes that we have in place, the systems that are already established through this lens, to try to find where we need to make those changes. And I think this also links with research that's Cynthia Okpiri is doing in University of East Anglia as well, around Black parenting requirements and assessment of Black parenting. And I think there's so much that we can learn from work that other people are doing in this area.
Okay, another question to all of you. I'll just read the full statement. If I can say, the summary of the issues so eloquently put through this project were exactly some of the issues I faced all those years ago when I started the adoption process. Is it fair to say that the decision makers in this space maintain the invisibility of this issue because of their own attitudes and biases, right from social workers to the courts? To accept racism is such a leap for those in positions of power, but I cannot see what else it can be that has upheld inequitable practice for so long.
Do you want to share any thoughts on that, Laurelle, first, and then maybe we can ask John and Tam for some perspectives?
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this, but I'll try and keep it brief. So in part, I definitely think decision makers play a key role. Fundamentally, a number of the issues that we are uncovering, but we already had, very clear hypothesis around our structural. So that means our senior decision makers, our policy makers, and a whole host of other people are signing off and enabling policies and practices that lead to these barriers and long-standing inequalities for racialised African Caribbean communities. Furthermore, at a local level, we know that the tools that we use, the systems and the practice and children's social care, but adoption specifically is often developed off of the lens and experience of white middle class, individuals. And so this system essentially does not work for Black, African, Caribbean communities, especially those that aren't middle class, those that are disabled, those that are single, those that are LGBTQ+, and so on. So the whole lens that we view our practice and our systems and our structures wasn't made for these communities. And so a key part of our work is to try and dismantle or adjust some of them so that they respond to the diversity of the children in the system and the families that they need. The courts, another example again of a structural level, but we could track this all the way back down to the interpersonal level and the way that we even think about different groups. And we've been socialized to think about different groups, especially Black boys, for example, as our research showed. So those are some of my initial thoughts. I totally agree with you. Yes, decision makers, but also a whole raft of other institutional, interpersonal and intrapersonal factors that have enabled these inequities and this racism for such a long time.
Thank you, Laurelle, and I'll invite Tam and John to share any comments. And I just wanted to add to that, I think something that we're finding and exploring more and more as the project goes on is recognizing that the system that we currently have, the way we currently work, isn't working. We wouldn't be experiencing this level of challenge in this area for so long if we were able to resolve this ourselves, if we knew, the people who are running this system knew how to resolve this problem. And so power sharing, involving people with lived experience at a really meaningful, influential level throughout everything that we're doing in the project is absolutely fundamental, because we don't have the answers. We need to listen to the people that do have the answers and give them power and influence in the way that we do things. So Tam, have you got any reflections on that question that you'd like to share?
Yes, it's just a point to say I absolutely agree with what Laurelle has just said. I've got just one perhaps additional point to make, that perhaps there are some tools out there that can be used within the system that we have. It's Eurocentric, yes, it's not working. And while we are trying to drive change within the system, the braced model, for example, is the model that has been created to support social workers to really think about some of the biases that they may experience during the work that they're doing and recruitment processes with Black adopters. So it might be a useful point that in supervision, this can be used. Social workers look at that to help them to really think about that. Whether you can de-bias or not is another question and another argument, but actually what that framework does is it helps people to really think about what's happening in that space. So I can post that in the chat later on. I also want to just highlight maybe the need for transparency, because speaking to a prospective adopter, one of the things that came up, and it's also within the braced model, that the goalpost changes all the time during assessments, and I'm sure this has come up. So maybe to think about what can we do in terms of transparency, that goalpost doesn't keep changing all the time in terms of the conversations that we're having. Well, if you said my bedrooms are okay and everything is okay, why is that changing at the next visit, for example? So how can we make social workers who are out there right in the forefront doing these assessments, how can we make them responsible and accountable for some of the work, as well as, of course, organizational? But the person who's going out there is going to make a decision and going to make a recommendation. What can we do to make sure that actually we're working in a way that is transparent and honest, and we're not changing our views? And that often comes from bias and maybe not being fair when we're doing our work. And I think it goes back to fairness as well, I think.
Yes, thank you, Tam. Transparency is a really key issue, and that has come up about expectations. Really being able to be honest in order to build that level of trust that we need people to have in us, because we're asking them to reveal such intimate details, and there needs to be trust and honesty and transparency there, and that's absolutely crucial.
Can I just say something very quickly before you move to the next point? It's the point that is burning within me, which is really about my colleague Prosper Tatum, who've worked on this, and we refer to this idea of race wrestling. And it's something that's coming to my mind listening to this. why is it Black families are always having to wrestle their race through the process? And I think if we keep that in our minds, that really should this be about wrestling in the work that we're doing? Just food for thought.
Yes, thank you. That's really, really helpful. John, have you got any reflections to share?
Just to agree really with Laurelle and Tam, I think that the questioner implies about the trauma of racism really, and I think that the systems do not, and some practitioners do not get that. The psychosocial, everyday, socioeconomic trauma that Black families experience, and Black people experience, and Black boys experience is just not acknowledged. I think that's where we're at in 2023. And that's what I heard in the question, really, that the many social welfare practitioners, educationalists in the criminal justice system, alongside the adoption system, don't get it. And it's the whole package. So it's the psychosocial, but also the socioeconomic everyday.
Thank you, John. Really, really important point, and absolutely borne out, I think, by everything that we're doing and learning. Absolutely. Have we got one more question? Maybe Hannah, have we got one more question that we might be able to take in the last few minutes?
I'm just going to quickly check in with Laurelle. Laurelle, did you have one in mind?
There are so many, so apologies if your question doesn't get read out. Okay, this one. So there are myths that Black families don't want to adopt that need challenging. Courts also believe that families can't be found. So it's more of a reflection than a question, but I think it's quite pertinent because some of our own findings from the focus groups aligned with this. So what focus group participants told us was that this notion of adoption in this formal sense isn't something they're familiar with. They're very familiar within African communities looking after children that weren't born in the family and doing what we might refer to as informal adoption, but having formal organisations and institutions coming into your home and doing assessments and telling you whether you're capable of looking after a child is something that they hadn't necessarily seen as an option for them or just recognised at all. But actually the concept of adoption was very familiar to them. So maybe your reflections on this, on myths around Black families and adoption and courts believing that families can't be found.
Yeah, I think that's a really it's a really complex issue and one that we've been thinking a lot about as well. Is actually it feeds into something we've been wrestling with when we share the findings of our report, share our research. That we need to also be conscious of unintended consequences, and that particularly feeds into this issue of, you know, we are evidencing something that we already suspect or know, which is the shortage of Black adopters for the number of children. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep being ambitious and making appropriate care plans for our Black children where adoption is the right plan for them. And obviously adoption isn't the right plan for every child, but where it is so, we really need to be still being absolutely accurate and ambitious in making those plans and driving through those plans, and doing everything we can to find adoptive families for those children. And I think sometimes the court can be concerned, but not just the court, you know, many other people involved in decision making as well. They're aware of the shortage of Black adopters, and that might influence and impact the decisions that they actually make around a care plan for a child. And that's something we're very conscious of in this project, and we need to continue to explore and name as we move forward, and as we try to hopefully get to a place where that isn't something that we need to take into consideration or think about when we're making plans, because that shouldn't be part of the decision making in deciding the right care plan for a child. I think we are coming right to the end of our meeting now, and I hope that we've given you a taster today of everything that we've been doing, and I think we have definitely managed to give you a taster of just how enormous this topic is, the potential is, the areas for us to explore and understand more, and we're really excited to be able to develop this network of people like yourselves who are interested in this area and also trying to address these difficulties. So I just wanted to remind you again before we finish to please click the link in your invite or in the chat to sign up to our newsletter. We are going to be rolling out regular webinars, and we really look forward to you joining us so that we can explore some of these more specific issues in a lot more depth with you and share the conversation. If you think that you are able to support us in the project in other ways or share learning, then please do get in touch with us through the chat or through the invite link. And we really look forward to continuing this conversation. So finally, we just wanted to say a big thank you to John and Tam for kindly agreeing to be with us today to share your insights, which has been really helpful for the conversation. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks, Lydia, and everyone. We will be making specific requests for support as well, just to be clear, to those on our mailing list. Thank you.